Welcome. We're going to talk about game IPs and brands, or I'm going to talk about game IPs and brands. And then we'll have a Q&A at the end. Before we start, can I just ask how many in this room are game developers? A lot. And publishers? Some. And academics? None. Oh, there's half. Okay, but not really willing to own up to it. Okay, so you read the program. It said we're going to talk about if you're trying to create a lasting IP and brand, what kind of traps do you need to avoid? What are the 10 problems that we see? And how do you solve them? And we've got a lot of work to do, so we better just start. So let's start with who am I? I started my career in games as a child, playing games. Dungeons and Dragons, computer games, Commodore 64, you know the drill. For me, it was always games and fiction, stories. And for me, Dungeons and Dragons really brought those things together. I made my own company in the early 2000s. We made 35 games for learning and advertising, things like that. I spent a few years of my life making an art game where you discussed your way through a found footage mystery with Hollywood stars and stuff like that. I think it was 15 years too early. And then I became head of IP development at Nordisk Games, which is Egmont's game investor. And I was there for the first 2 years where we did a sprint. We spent $140 million on 6 studios. And the big question that I was there to answer was the one that more and more investors are asking today, which is basically, how do you take these games and make them into lasting entertainment properties? And while I was there, I met 2 guys who were, I was looking at that from the story side, the characters, the legal ownership, and so on. But I met 2 guys who were looking at it from the brand side. So basically, we started a company together called Leverage, which is all about helping game companies to build IPs and brand. And that's us. So I'm the IP guy, David is a brand strategist, and Jerry is a creative director from the brand side. So what we're really combining is the knowledge of how does the universe and the characters and the story work with how do you position that in the market. And right now we're working with Bandai Namco and PlayOn, Supermassive, and a bunch of others. And I think until last year, nobody knew what we were talking about. So every time we would talk to people, they would go, huh? And then something happened last summer, and ever since, we've had 4 to 5 clients simultaneously. So we can talk about that during the Q&A. What happened, I'm not quite sure. So the method we've developed over the last 4 years is that you need to look at the process from your original idea to becoming an entertainment property as a process, which has clear stages, which has a clear terminology, which means you can actually work in a goal-oriented way with this. We're going to come back to this particular slide later. You came here for the 10 most common mistakes. Let's get started. Common mistake number 10. So we're counting down to the most important, of course. So the first one is that most game companies underestimate the need for lasting value. So this is what it looks like to be a game developer, right? You have an idea, and you start thinking, well, it would be great to have a hit game. That's our goal. The problem is, if you get to that goal, you will realize, as some of you have, that you didn't need a hit game. Well, you wanted it, but what you really wanted was a lasting entertainment property. And that means that having a good game is not enough. Now, having a good game is just the first big milestone. And you have a bunch of other stuff you need to do if you want to have something that will stay in the market, from game to game to game, cross into other media, and so on. And the problem is, if you get to having a hit game without having thought about these things, you have to start again, because there's nothing to continue with. So the example I like to use is IO Interactive. I'm from Copenhagen. IO Interactive is about 10 kilometers down the road. They spent 20 years building a game studio. They had 200 people on the payroll. They had their own game engine. And they had made multiple series of games. But when they sold the company to Square Enix, the rights to that character were 65% of the value of the entire company. Not the people, not the tech, not the building, that character. And that character is an IP, right? It's a specific visual design that you can own, and you can defend it in a court of law. And whenever people see it, they get certain emotions attached to it because they know the emotional journey that that character always takes. In the same way that when you buy a ticket to a Harry Potter film or a James Bond film, or you buy the Harry Potter book, you kind of know what you're going to get. And that's what an IP can do. And 65% of the value of the company isn't bad either. Common mistake number 9. Making games about things. So I'm sure you have a great game. You should have a great game, and you should definitely be aiming for that, no question. And I'm sure that making the gameplay and the tech and the level design and all these things is probably 80% of the resources. But unfortunately, what makes the IP valuable is that there is an emotional connection or relationship between the audience and the objects of the IP. It's not enough that the gameplay is super fucking great. It's essential. I completely agree. Without great gameplay, forget it. But there's another thing, which is that all the time people spend playing that gameplay, you need to build an emotional relationship with the character or whatever it is that is your IP. So the question quickly becomes, what is the emotional core of your game? Not how does it cause addiction, or how does it hook you, or how does it give you satisfaction? All of that is important, but that's not my problem. That's your problem. My problem is, how are you establishing an emotional relationship while I'm being hooked on your gameplay? So things do not cause emotional connections. I like money, but it's not what causes an emotional connection. And the world does not cause the emotional connection either. What causes an emotional connection is a personal relationship between characters. Between the player and characters, and between characters and other characters. And that means that as soon as you're thinking about a sequel, and let's face it, if we're talking long-term, we're talking about a franchise, we're talking about a series of games, we're potentially talking about something that moves into other media. There needs to be, because if you come in and you're trying to make number 2, that's your first job. Your first job is to figure out what was the emotional connection, because if you're not paying that off in the next game, people are going to be disappointed, right? If you make a new James Bond film, but it's only about Moneypenny, we don't really want the agents anymore, you're not honoring the emotional connection that James Bond has made with his audience. So emotional stories happen between characters. And I'm sorry, if you insist you want to make a game about triangles, that's fine. But it's going to be really tough to make it into an IP. Think about it like this. People talk about Game of Thrones being about climate change, right? Winter is coming and all the nations have to work together, otherwise everybody's going to die. Or is it really about zombies, or is it about dragons? It's about all those things for sure, but where is the emotional connection? Not many people have seen a dragon in real life, so it's difficult to connect emotionally with a dragon. I would posit that Game of Thrones is about families not working, right? It's like a shit show of dysfunctional families. It's about a dwarf who's not being respected by his father. It's about a girl who doesn't want to do all the girly shit. She wants to kill people with swords. It's about another girl who gets married badly again and again and again. And these are things we can relate to. These are things we recognize from our own lives. And then it's got dragons. That's cool. But the emotional connection is to the stuff we recognize. Common mistake number 8, which is in direct extension of number 7, right? Relatability means something we recognize from our own lives. We can relate to it. Uniqueness means you own it because nobody else in the market is doing it. So when you're thinking about a tentpole character like Lara Croft or Harry Potter or Spider-Man or Pippi Longstocking, that should be a major project for your game. It should not be, hey, somebody doodled a cool character, let's put it in. It should not be something that's done over the weekend. It should be a project running in parallel with the rest of the game, with the engine, with the level design, with the story, with everything. Because in the end, if you're successful, that's going to be the majority of the value of your company. Think about that. So it needs to be something that people can relate to, and they need to go on an emotional journey that means they actually end up loving that character. And that's a big ask, right? You are asking for love. And then it needs to be unique. It needs to be so unique that if somebody else does something that looks like it, your lawyer can kill them. That's what we're talking about, right? If it's just another generic knight or a World War II soldier or whatever, your lawyer will tell you, I'm sorry, there's too many of those on the market already. You can't defend it in a court of law. And that means it has no value on your balance sheet because anybody can do it. But if you succeed by, among other things, giving the character goals and a unique attitude and interesting relationships like a dwarf not being respected by his father, and conflicts and a unique enough visual design that nobody else can do it, then we're talking about a tentpole character that you can use and you can own. And what is it that makes them so unique? Well, it's different. I mean, Spider-Man is easy, right? I mean, that's a pretty clear design. I'm working with a lawyer who had to defend Pippi Longstocking in court because they were making all kinds of Halloween costumes and I don't know what. And what he was told was, you can't own a girl with freckles and, red hair. But if she's lifting a horse, you can own that. Because there's not that many horse-lifting, red-haired, small girls around. So if you get in there first with that, you own it. So it's not just about the exact visual design of the eyes, it's also about the abilities and so on. You probably can't own a bald man, but if you put him in a suit and give him 2 silver guns and give him a red tie, and maybe a pin code in the back of the head, then we're talking about something that's pretty unique, and you can own that. Okay. Common mistake number 7. You need to integrate your IP in your gameplay. These are not two completely separate things. So what we see a lot when we're asked to analyze a half-finished game or a pitch for a game or whatever, is that we don't see the connection between the emotions in the IP and the story that creates that emotional journey and what's going on in the game. So the thing that needs to happen is that we need to assign emotional meaning to tasks and missions. It should not be, honestly, go out and gather a lot of mink pelts and come back and give them to me and I'll give you an upgrade. There needs to be a reason why those mink or whatever they are important. They need to be important to somebody. There needs to be something at stake. And if you start doing that, then suddenly you can start attaching emotion to the results, right? Bringing back those fur pelts means that the family that was going to be kicked out of their home will now be able to stay in their home, and they tearfully thank you and so on. And they offer you the ring of invisibility that they had gone down from generation to generation. The point is, suddenly it's not just a mission, suddenly it's an emotional journey. But of course, you need to tie that emotional journey to the IP you want to repeat. And that's kind of a big thing. So the big question is going to be, can you repeat the emotional journey you're taking the audience on? So now we're getting into the thick of it. Think about Harry Potter. There's 7 books, right? Yes, they're kind of different stories, but they're also kind of the same. So in every book, I would say, the emotional journey is exactly the same. Harry goes to school, Harry gets bullied, Harry works hard, Harry tries to figure out who he can trust, Harry wins. So Goblet of Fire or whatever other thing is going on, Secret of Chambers, it's that emotional journey again. And think about James Bond, it's always basically the same emotional journey. It's a new villain every time, there's a new subplot, there may be a new woman or a new man, but it's the same emotional journey. And you need to think about this. This goes back to uniqueness, because you don't want to do the same emotional journey that somebody else owns. But it also goes to relatability. Is it something I feel is real to me? Not many people have wizards in their lives, or magic schools, or brooms they can fly on, or things. But everybody understands bullying. Right? I would posit that Harry Potter's relatability comes from bullying. It's all about bullying, all the way up to, the big baddie who's trying to bully the whole world. But we connect emotionally, and that emotional journey can be repeated. You look at Hitman, it's kind of the bad employer emotional journey, right? He doesn't trust his employer, he's trying to find out who he is, but there's that constant thing going on. It's the same in every game. They own that. And because the character on top of that, also in Harry Potter's case, has become unique enough in its design with the round glasses and the wand and everything, and with the Hitman, they own the thing that represents that emotional journey. So now they can sell that thing, or they can value it, or they can make more games, films, whatever, with that thing. But to do that, you need a story. And I know games and stories have been at war for centuries, but if you really want to build an IP, at least if you want a narrative IP, you have to have a lot of story. And that's a problem we often see. We come in halfway into a game production. They say, well, we're really happy with the tech, we're really happy with the gameplay, but the story's kind of not really happening. And it's because often there's just not enough of it. So one thing is that in one game, you need a lot of story, right? If you're going to be playing for 10 hours, 20 hours, or even more, that is a lot of story. A movie is 2 hours, and that's a lot of story. A TV series? Okay, now we're talking same kind of length as a medium-sized game, right? Or even a small game. Multiple seasons of a TV series, that's a massive amount of story. And yet a lot of the game teams we talk to is, the story is just the guy who likes to type doing it. Or the one who played the dungeon master in the crew when they first got together. Building a story is a craft. In Hollywood, they have writers' rooms with, 5 to 10 professional writers, educated in dramaturgy and things like that, working out the mechanics of how a series will work. Game makers need to take that more seriously. I know some do, and I know, CD Projekt Red is fucking amazing at it, but honestly, they're an exception. Most game development companies are coming from an engineering background or a technology background, and this story thing, the Swedes have a thing called I darken something. It means I don't really want to know, That's how most game developers are about story. They don't have the language for it, they don't really know how to talk about it. Just do something. And that's not going to work, especially not the way the market is moving now, where we're moving out of just making games to making entertainment. And I think you probably noticed the investors are more and more saying, yeah, that looks like a great game, but can it become an IP? Can it become an entertainment property? So this is a typical story construction, right? Each arc is a big dramatic question that has not been answered yet. So if this is, for example, we could say this was a 3-movie plot, where Act 1 was the first movie, and Act 2 was the second movie, and Act 3 was the third movie. You'll notice that at the very top there's one big arc. So that means there's one big question that goes over all the episodes and is not answered yet. If Game of Thrones was 3 episodes, that question would be, what happens when winter arrives, right? That's the one that's not answered until the end of the story. But then there's lots of little ones as well. So even the first of these episodes has one big one and 2 smaller ones. So, Act 1 there could be what will happen between the dwarf and his father. But even that breaks down, there's also other questions. So all of these things are creating tension and interest. We call it narrative desire. We want to see what happens next. And the more of them you can stack, the longer people are going to stay, if you get them emotionally involved, of course. So it's very much about thinking long-term. And if you're thinking franchise, if you're thinking a series of games, you have to have a big question that will last for multiple games. So the big question, of course, what happens when winter comes, or will this character ever fall in love with that character, or whatever. It needs to be sustainable. And then there's the long-term arcs, right? So you really have to keep it going. So this is not random. I'm trying to tell you there's a storytelling craft, but in, I think, 80% of the studios we work with, that is not taken seriously at all. There's one person out of 70, there's a team of 70, and there's only one person who understands this. And nobody listens to her because they don't understand the same language. What they want to talk about is graphics and interaction design and UI and things like that. So a really good trick, I would say, is educate the whole team in the basics of story. Get local academics from the drama school to come in and start talking about what is a story, how does it work, how do you make a serial story and all that. Because if the whole team can start getting that vocabulary, suddenly you have a dialogue on a whole different level. And that girl or woman or guy or boy who's the one writing, suddenly they're getting intelligent feedback and not just being told what to do by whoever has the highest payroll, which we see a heck of a lot, right? That's the great thing about being a consultant, is you can say no to the boss. But the person hired in as a writer is often not a partner. And every day she's being overruled by the head of concept art and the head of combat and the creative director because he saw something on TV last night that he thinks is kind of cool. So, yeah, that's definitely a big one. Common mistake number 5. I thought I would exaggerate the font here. Don't underestimate the design of the fictional universe. So we often see that the backstory is just too light and just too unemotional. So the point here is that stories are not just about what happens now. It's not just about what does this character do to this character on the screen. It's also about what happened before they got there. And if you do that in an interesting way, then actually discovering what happened before is half the fun. I'll give you an example, right? Bloodborne, one of my favorite games. In Bloodborne, most of the story happened before you arrived. And of course, the gameplay is amazing, and everything is great, I think. But if you look at it from an IP angle, what really generates that sort of tension, that feeling of mystery and awe that underlies everything, is all the stuff that happened in Yharnam before you got there. And you can go on YouTube and you'll get all these great streamers saying, explaining the backstory. And it takes about 2 hours to explain. But if you think of it, the way they did it, I think, is that they wrote what was happening before, right? There's these two churches, and one of them has discovered this weird blood because there's a god in a cellar under a cathedral or something. It's big and it's complicated and it's not good for human beings. And think of it as a vase, right? Think of it as a beautiful Greek urn. And what they do then is they smash it. And then they put the pieces all over the place. And the player can spend the next 40 hours picking up these pieces and saying, okay, so there's a god under the cathedral. And then you pick up another piece and go, there's something about blood. And slowly you piece it together. I can't even tell you the story, but I don't care because it feels real. What I'm getting is the feeling that this thing is real because it's bigger than what I can see. And that's what reality is like as well, right? We see a little bit about the war here and the war there, and we're trying to piece it together, but it's much bigger than what we will never see all of it. And that's a great trick because it also means you don't have to make a super linear Hollywood story. What you're doing is you're building a universe with a great story and you're letting the player piece it together themselves and discuss online what actually happened. It's pretty neat, especially because doing something like the God of War, where you really have a Hollywood story that happens beat for beat, is insanely expensive. I mean, the big trick with that, I think, and we often warn, we meet some studios and say, hey, we're going to make this linear story, and we're like, have you ever done that before? And they're like, no, but it's going to be like God of War, except different. And then what we really do is we say, okay, so do you have the management structures for that? Do you have the budget for it? Do you even understand how stories are made? Because it's not just about writing it. You have to get it into the level design. Suddenly you have to coordinate every department so that that emotional beat lands on the gameplay, on the visual design, on the level design. And that's very different. This is actually much easier to do. I'm not saying it's easy to make Bloodborne, but from a story perspective, that's two very different challenges. So the backstory, which is this one, this common mistake, excuse me, actually has the player walking through the aftermath of the story, which is pretty smart. You're a minor player. You're not really going to make that much of a difference to this universe, but you're going to discover the story behind it. And if you want a masterclass in this, buy Bone, right? It's a comic book, graphic novel. I think it's 1,497 pages long. It's brilliant. It's like a cartoon version of Lord of the Rings, except it's not. It's different. But what's great about it, from a backstory perspective, is that quite quickly, within the first 100 pages, you'll start to wonder what the hell is going on. There's all sorts of funny stuff happening, and combat, and relationships, and so on, but you don't understand the big backstory. And I think you have to wait until page 1297 when they tell you what happened in the old days that is causing all this trouble. And that is just a hugely satisfying arc that you've been asked this question about, you're asking yourself this question about what happened in the world to make everything like this, and you go through 1,297 super entertaining pages, and suddenly you realize everything clicks into place. This is what happened. This is why the world will end shortly if we don't do what's right. Yeah, check it out. And I didn't even spoil it, right? Common mistake number 4. I'd like to ask this to the room. What is the thing we see about the position of the writer in the company that is the most common IP mistake? Number 4. Any guesses? I don't think you need a microphone. Just shout it out if you...
An afterthought.
Louder.
An afterthought.
An afterthought. Yeah, that's that's deadly if this is what you want to do.
Not present.
Not present, yeah. Okay, it's not quite that bad, but yes, that would be a problem. Okay, the problem is, I guess I kind of spoiled it earlier, that the problem is that the writer does not have enough authority in the company. If you're trying to make a story game, then telling the writer to shut up because the level design is more important is not going to work. What we've seen a few times, even in the 4 years, game development cycle is 3+ years, but even in the 4 years we've been doing this, we've seen quite a few times this problem with the writer not being heard. And at the end of the process, nobody understands why the story is no good. It doesn't work. The problem is that, as I said before, writing is a craft. It has a different language than engineering. It needs to be understood. And we've seen quite a few times that, the writer will, sometimes with us, have spent, weeks integrating all the different ideas, the concept art and the gameplay progression and everything into a single story that finally works. And then, the creative director saw something on TV last night. Listen, we're going to replace the main character with a rubber monkey. It's going to be fucking cool. I saw it last night on TV. And that's like taking one of those cogs out and saying, look, we're just going to put that over here. Oh, no, we're going to make it square instead of a cog. The engine is not going to start, right? All those meticulously crafted arcs just collapse. So, yes, the writer needs to speak up. It's also the writer's fault, right? Writers are a little bit inward-facing. I know gamers like me are generally inward-facing, but writer gamers, that's really inward-facing. They have to thump the fucking table and say, no, that's not going to work. The problem is they have to say that to the person who can fire them, right? And that's almost impossible. That's just too much to ask. That they're to tell the creative director who owns half the company that he's wrong, that a rubber monkey is the wrong thing to introduce in a romantic game or a high fantasy game or whatever. So what that actually demands is it demands quite a lot from management. It demands quite a lot from the creative management and leadership that they're able to listen to the writers and also to educate themselves so they can actually talk to them. Number 3. Now, the word genre is complicated in games. So I think we all kind of know, a genre is a type of thing. We know that a first-person shooter is a genre for a game, right? It has certain things about the way you look and the way you fight and things like that. It gets tricky around here because now we've got 2 kinds of genres, right? We've got the gameplay genre and the story genre. And these are 2 different things, because you wouldn't talk about a story as a shooter. If it was a movie, you wouldn't talk about a shooter movie or a first-person shooter movie. I know something like that has been made, but it's not a genre. So over here, we've got shooters and strategy games and Sims and whatever. Over there, we've got gangster stories, we've got heroic fantasy, we've got, I don't know, combat stories and things like that, horror stories. So we have to learn to think about these 2 things as separate. In my world, you can have a shooter romance, right? You can shoot your way to love. We can make a first-person shooter where you're fighting to get to your loved one. And we slowly build that relationship as you shoot your way through all the people who are treating her badly or whatever, or him. So these 2 things can be combined in many different ways. And you have to understand on the story side that these are shared structures, style elements, and themes. So if you say Western, immediately you know, okay, there's going to be hats, there's going to be horses, there's going to be probably some kind of independent spirit, and so on. So a whole lot of things come into your head, and your expectations are immediately set. Now, expectations are fucking deadly, especially when you start marketing your game, right? If you create expectations that your game does not fulfill, you know there's going to be a shitstorm. You know that if you market your game as a Western and then they start playing it and it turns out to be a romance, people are going to get pissed. They haven't been given what they were sold. And the next thing about genres is they have a proven connection to the audience. So if you want to make something completely original, that's not a genre, that's totally cool. That is called art. You are making something new, something that nobody has done before. More power to you. If you do it well, you've expressed yourself and you've created art. I think that's great. I wish I could do it. But if you're picking up the Western or the fantasy or whatever, then immediately there are strong expectations. And you need to understand what those expectations are, because if you're not fulfilling them, you better be doing it in a way that's really interesting. So let me illustrate. Part 4 has not been made, as far as I know. But immediately you look at this, there's a whole bunch of stuff you start expecting from this movie, right? There's complicated family relationships, there's spaghetti, there's a certain business model that's pretty violent, and so on. There's a setting, and there's also a whole visual set of expectations, the way it's going to be lit and filmed, and so on. If I add one thing, I can completely fuck that up, right? Now it's like, whoa, what? I've got two sets of expectations at war in my head. So, the power of genre is pretty huge. And yes, it's a powerful thing on the gameplay side, but it's also a very powerful thing on the story side. And I think at least half the time we come in and consult on a game, our first conclusion is you don't understand the story genre you're working in. You haven't taken the time to understand what a gangster film or book does. I see you understand the tactical gameplay or the resource management or whatever, but what are the classic beats in a gangster story? You don't have to follow them, but you do have to understand them. And that brings us back to the writer, right? This is not an untypical walkthrough of the number of genres in a single game, right? This is actually taken from some consulting we did at one point. So it actually started out being a scientist meets God story, like 2001 and Arrival and all that. And then suddenly you were on a planet and it was like a safari adventure and you were cataloging different creatures and so on. And then boom, you were in a haunted house and it was weird and scary and so on, and so on and so on. So every level it would change genre. And you can hear it's the rubber monkey coming back, right? Oh, let's do the next level. I saw something cool on TV last night. Let's do that. So that's not actually deadly. What you need to do then is to take one of them and bring it to the front and make sure that is the main one. Then there can be variations under the surface, but you need to have that big one at the front. And the challenge with audiences is, I don't know if you know this, it's a Silicon Valley thing where you've got the early adopters out here, and in the middle you have the mainstream audience. And the trick, of course, is that the early adopters are really articulate. They really know what they want. So the danger for you, especially if you're doing live or you're doing early access or something, is that you're going to get the yellow crowd in while you're in early access, because they like new stuff. And they don't really mind if it's a bit broken or whatever, because they understand the game so well and the genre or whatever. That's not a problem. For them, it's important that it's new. The further you get to the middle, the less important it is that it's new. For the mainstream audience, it better work, and it better give me exactly what I was expecting. And plus, what I was expecting is not a specific genre of gameplay or anything. I'm just asking for revenge or romance or something like that. So the problem is that the further you get into the middle, the more emotional the audience is. So the further you're out here, the more intellectual, articulate, and understanding your audience will be. But the bigger audience is just, this isn't working, fuck it. Or this, I thought it was a gangster movie and there's a robot, I'm not playing that. They might have thought it was interesting out there, but in the middle I tell you, no. So that makes it a little tricky. Okay, coming towards the end. Common mistake number 2. You're starting the brand conversation too damn late, right? Your brand is how you're going to communicate this game to the market. So we have an IP, we have a game, both things are great. How are we going to place it in the market? Who are our competitors? Who is our audience? All these things. So this is where we think about this process, where for us it's very much about understanding the original artistic intent first. What is the team trying to say? What's the story about? And so on. Then it's about, okay, so what is the IP here? What's the core of it that's going to continue from game to game and into the TV series and so on? Then it's about how are we going to talk about that in the marketplace? Who are our main audiences? Who are our main competitors? How are we going to win them? The sooner you start that conversation, the less unhappy you're going to be when you get to these two. Because then you're not going to be surprised. So I've got 2 partners who are brand experts, and the thing they hate most is a call saying, hey, we've got a lot of money, but we've only got 4 months to launch and we don't have a brand. Because the first thing we have to do is there even an IP to put in there? And then we have to start that conversation. It would have been much better if that conversation had been going on all the way down. So a brand is not about slapping something new on top of your great game. It's about understanding the artistic intent, and then it's about figuring out what's the vision for the final product, what's the competitive landscape, how are we going to position it so that we're different enough but not so different that we're weird, and so on. And then it's about bringing in some specialists who can actually look at your game like a stranger would look at it. So we get a lot of companies saying, hey, our own concept artist is going to do the key art. And for us, that's, no, don't do it. He or she knows the game too well. You need somebody who doesn't know the game at all. Because you need to see it as a stranger would see it. And when it works, you get something that amplifies the core IP. It is positioned so the right audience just thinks, whoa, that's cool. It communicates, you know, the main emotion immediately. It stands out in the market. It's different. It has a lot going on in 3 seconds, and it's consistent so that every time people see one of your ads, they're getting a little more familiar with the same thing. We see some game companies where every ad is different, and you don't even know it's the same game. People have to see something 9 times before they remember it. So when all that comes together, you can own a position in the market. And that's what you want. That's why there's not that many Hitman games. It's because you're going up against an established franchise and they've built a castle. They own that position in the market. And it's really difficult to break it down. If you don't have that, you're competing on features. And you know who competes on features? Low-cost, cheap products. You don't want to compete on features. You want to have a unique emotional position in the market. I know 80% of the game production is gameplay and tech and all that stuff. Of course it is. But you got to get this right as well. And that brings us to common mistake number 1, which we see all the time, which is that the team basically has nothing to say, and neither does the creative lead in the company. We just want to make a game. IPs have something to say. Harry Potter is saying something about what it means to be a child and a growing human and so on. Game of Thrones is saying something. Lara Croft is saying something. So you need to have a purpose. You need to know what it is you're trying to say as an artist. And you need it to be pretty clear, and you probably need one person to really know it. So, you know, you could say that Bloodborne is about forbidden knowledge and Macbeth is about ruthless ambition and so on. Think about that, you know. One sentence, tape it to the top of your screen, this is what it's about. And it's not just about being artsy-fartsy and having, you know, ooh, I'm really posh. It's also about if you don't have it, all these different things are going to be pointing in different directions, and it's going to be confusing as fuck. You've got hundreds of people working on this game, and they all have to pursue the same vision so that you produce a hammer that just hits people right in the head. I mean that in a good way. It should look like that, right? It should all be pointing in the same direction. And that means that your story has to have a purpose. Beyond entertainment and beyond earning money. And even worse,
or better.
You have to believe it. As you probably know even better than me, the internet is the biggest bullshit detector ever invented. Bullshit just gets shut down, unless you're Donald Trump, then it floats. But most of the time, bullshit will just get shut down really quickly. So pick a theme, tell them something that you believe in, because you're going to be believing in it for years, and people are going to know if you don't mean it. So that's it. These are our 10 most common mistakes on IPs and brands. I think we have 10 minutes to do Q&A. There are microphones and there are questions. I think you were first, then we'll do you afterwards. Can we get a microphone over here?
Hello? Oh, great, it works. So I have a question, and I wanted to ask because, I liked parts of the talk a lot, and other parts of the talk...
You like what?
I liked parts of the talk a lot, and other parts not that much. Basically, there was a lot about story. And I think you mentioned Harry Potter like 5 times. You mentioned Hitman a couple of times. But actually, as far as I know, the biggest IP is Pokemon with $92 billion. And Harry Potter has like $30 billion. So, we have the emotional connection with Pokemon in games, but basically they tell the same story every time, which works purely on emotions. And so, if I apply all those points, how can it be that something like Pokemon out-earns Star Wars by 1/3 and Harry Potter by 3 times? Shouldn't there be the emotional aspect way heavier, judged for games?
But I would say that there is, I'm not a Pokemon expert, but the great thing about Pokemon, from a core story perspective, there's this whole trainer story, right?
Yes, it's an idea. It's that overarching one big idea they sell, but they don't have characters. They don't have
It doesn't have character. Pokemon has more characters than anybody.
Yeah, but they have different characters in every game. So it's not like in the cinematic universe.
Yeah.
Yes.
Look, I think you have a very good point, and I think Pokemon does not fit perfectly with this, but it's the same business model, right? We're creating emotion about creatures' designs that we own. And people are getting emotional connections to different creatures. And the repeatable emotional story of the trainer collecting and winning tournaments or whatever is in there. So I would say, yeah, that works. But you're right, it's not a classic model. But it's not like there's only one way to do it, right? I'm sorry if it sounds like that.
No, it's more just if I look at the percentage and I look just how big Pokemon is as an IP. But thanks for answering.
It is big. But there are a lot of variations. My favorite is Overwatch, which is really doing pretty much this for every character. But having Overwatch's budget, I'm looking forward to that. I think you were next. Yeah. I actually think it was.
Yeah, sorry, but I wanted to actually answer the previous question of the friend.
So you want to answer him?
Yeah, yeah, because I also thought about Pokemon. Yeah, because many of those points don't fit Pokemon, but actually the game was first. Yeah, it was 96. I actually googled that while you were talking, and the manga was 97, along with anime in 98. So, despite the game not having a best story, and despite the game not meeting many of those points, they actually followed with those emotions in anime, where the friendship is the most important connection with Pokemon. And also, I believe that toys played a huge role in the IP. So, yeah, that's
I think also it's different at the end. Everybody talking, well, Star Wars has all these different things going on. Yeah, but it didn't originally. Originally, there was one movie, and then there was 2, and there was 3, and they had one story. Today, I know, because it's so popular, you can start to do a lot of different things. Yeah. But there's a few rules here. You cannot use the Holy Bible or Star Wars as an example of how to build an IP, because when they get that big, you can do anything because you're so popular. So I think we need to go to this guy now.
Okay, I have a question. It's not about Pokemon, and I would like to ask about a more like practical approach to this establishing IP, because we know that we need something which is relatable and unique, and it's difficult to combine these things. And like, how do we even start this process of looking for this thing? And like, how do we know we might be close? Like, this actually might be like next Lara Croft or next Agent 47. Like, how do we know?
How do you know? Well, it depends where you are in the process, I guess. But
Very
it is
beginning.
I'm sorry?
In the very beginning.
At the very beginning. Well, then you need to set up some goals, right? For example, if you say we want to have a relatable character that we can own and that has an emotional journey that we can repeat. Those are 3 clear goals, right? So when is it relatable? Well, maybe you can write a 1-page description of her and you can give it to people. Read this. Do you like her? Do you want to know more? You know, in the beginning, it's going to be that simple. Then you talk about, we need a repeatable emotional journey. Well, you can pitch a story in 5 beats. You know, like I just pitched Harry Potter going to school and then there's this end. Does anybody else have that emotional journey? Is it unique enough? Can our writer write it in a way that is actually emotional? And can we imagine more stories with the same emotional journey? Obviously, it's going to evolve a lot over the 3 years, but if we start with something that could work, then it will hopefully only get better. The last thing, can I own it in a court of law? Ask a lawyer. Take your design to a lawyer and say, can I protect this in a court of law? And, you know, if they don't know, get them to contact an IP lawyer because they can actually go out and check it. But you can start by yourself. My favorite example is Shovel Knight, right? It's a blue knight with a shovel. Nobody else has that, you know? We were working on one project where the company were making birds. And we went to the lawyer and he said, look, there's a lot of birds around. That's going to be difficult to own. So they ended up putting techno helmets on the birds. Nobody else had birds with techno helmets. Okay, you can own that. The tricky thing, of course, is that those techno helmets are probably not going to help you have a hit. But if you do have a hit, they're going to help you to own it. And that's the tricky thing. Okay,
thank you.
Do I need a microphone or you can hear me?
I think I can hear you. But maybe the others can't.
I'm wondering, what do you think about Death Stranding? The main character here isn't something created fictionally, but it's actual human beings. I don't think you can own the rights to his avatar for.
Yeah, good question.
For
I mean,
in future.
I think there were probably some pretty complicated rights negotiations about the face of Norman Reedus and so on. I think it becomes a question of, I'm not an IP lawyer, but I think it quickly becomes a question of what are you combining with this face? The helmet, the baby, the weird half helicopter thing and so on. That's pretty iconic. I haven't played the game, but from what I hear, it's quite a unique emotional experience. So my feeling is that that's actually quite a strong IP. Can you own that face? I think you can if he's willing to sign it over to you. He probably isn't. There's probably a pretty complicated negotiation right there. But that's how it is. Personally, if I was a game maker, I would be very careful about hanging my franchise on an actor because it's just so complicated. I would try to own the face of my character. But of course, Hideo Kojima wants to be cool, right? And he wants Hollywood actors, so it's a different calculus, I think. Plus, he's got more money than God, so, you know, it's different. There's a guy who needs a microphone down here. No more time? we'll have to continue the conversation out in the hall. Thank you very much.